All of us know the story of the Alter Rebbe and the slippers. The Alter Rebbe escaped from Napoleon Bonaparte, whom he hated deeply. He saw him as the antithesis of everything holy and everything pure and everything fine and everything kind. There's actually a letter from the Mittler Rebbe, from the Alter Rebbe's son, where he describes the things the Alter Rebbe described Napoleon as. And it sounds very Hitler-esque. The Alter Rebbe didn't see him as this nice guy. But the Alter Rebbe also felt that Napoleon had koiches, had powers from on high. Evil powers, but nevertheless real powers, and he was afraid of Napoleon. He needed to defeat Napoleon spiritually, but one of the things that was very, very important to the Alter Rebbe, in as much as that was concerned, was that he should not be under Napoleon's jurisdiction. He didn't want Napoleon to be his master, his emperor, as it were, even for a moment. And therefore, when Napoleon's armies approached Liadi, where he was living, he ran east, he ran deeper into Russia. And the story, of course, was that the family left, and the Alter Rebbe remembered that he left a pair of slippers in the attic, an old pair of worn-out slippers, and he went back himself to get them. He had a caravan of 60 wagons, and the Russian government at that time was providing them with a military guard to expedite their travels, both as an honor guard and, of course, to get through all kinds of checkpoints and so forth. They went back with the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe ran into his attic, took the slippers, left his home, and instructed the locals to put his home on fire, to ignite his house, to burn it to the ground. And then he left. And I heard a tape from the Rebbe, which is obviously quoting a sikha from his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, where he describes how the Alter Rebbe and his small party exited Ein Breg, one edge of the city, and Napoleon's expeditionary force, his leading troops, came into the city from the opposite edge. They immediately went for the Alter Rebbe's home. The house was on fire. They forced the people in the city to make a water line and try to extinguish the fire, but they couldn't. The house burned to the ground, and nothing was left. And as the previous Rebbe describes, Napoleon said he'll pay in rendlach, in gold, for anybody who would give him anything belonging to the Alter Rebbe, a piece of bread, a coin. And again, the understanding is that Napoleon also understood that he had some kind of negative powers, that had he in his possession anything of the Alter Rebbe's belongings, he could have used it to compromise the Alter Rebbe. It's a strange story. You're thinking about a tzaddik, a Rebbe, who's afraid of an evil force of Tumah, but that's the case. The Eibishter creates Zel Yuma Zeh, even on this highest of levels. And the Alter Rebbe personally went back to retrieve a worn-out pair of slippers. And of course, we link those slippers to the mystical concept of Pachim Ktanim, the small jugs, the leftover vessels. The expression Pachim Ktanim appears in the Rashi on the Pasuk on which the Maamar we're currently learning is based. We're learning a Maamar, and this is, of course, lesson 3 on this Maamar, that describes the meeting of Yaakov and the Malach, the angel of Eisav. If we wanted to be dramatic, we would describe it in the following light. Yaakov Avinu is afraid, seriously afraid, really afraid. Like the Alter Rebbe was afraid of Napoleon, Yaakov was afraid of Eisav. And you wonder, how could a man as holy and as connected as Yaakov Avinu, the choicest of the patriarchs, God Almighty had personally said to him, Anochi imoch, ushmarticha b'chelesh atelech, I'm with you and I'm going to watch you, v'ashiv esicha, and I'm going to bring you back home, and so forth and so on. And Yaakov is afraid. And of course, Rashi already and all the Mefarshim wonder the same thing. What was Yaakov afraid of? But the fact of the matter is, Yaakov was seriously afraid of Eisav. When you learn the Chumash, especially with the Mefarshim, one of the nicest commentaries on this, I believe, is the Shalach HaKadosh, who explains the entire story as happening on 2 levels, the physical Eisav and the spiritual Eisav. You get the following impression. Yaakov was afraid not because of Eisav. Eisav was an evil man, but he was a human being, and Yaakov had koiches, had powers that God Almighty gave him. He would have managed. Yaakov understood that Eisav comes with a force, a heavenly force, that's energetic, it's powerful. To use Kabbalah language, it comes from Olam HaToyu, which is higher than Tikkun, which is, in other words, higher than the spiritual force of Yaakov Avinu, and it's the Malach of Eisav that Yaakov fears. And the Torah tells us the story that Yaakov prepares to meet his brother, and he goes back for Pachim Ktanim, for small jugs, and Vayeavek Eish Emo, he encounters the Malach of Eisav. And in a few short psukim, a very dramatic description of the meeting between Yaakov and Eisav. And one of the things that people so often miss in that story is that it was a draw. It was a tie. Nobody won. Eisav's Malach grabs Yaakov, and as our Maamar describes it, he intends on defeating Yaakov to throw him to the ground. And he's incapable of doing it. But Yaakov returns the favor. He doesn't let go. He holds on. And these two beings, these two entities, these two people wrestle and wrestle and wrestle until the sun comes up. When the sun comes up, Eisav's Malach loses. But he's not defeated by Yaakov, he's defeated by the daylight. And the idea, of course, is Eisav's Malach is evil, and evil angels are very good for the darkness. Light is their antithesis. Light is their enemy. Daylight, which represents the overt presence of God Almighty, is something that Eisav's Malach cannot encounter, cannot handle, cannot deal with. And he says to Yaakov, you got to let me go. And Yaakov says, no, I'm not letting you go. And that's how Yaakov wins. Yaakov wins because Eisav's Malach can't afford a stalemate. He can't afford what they call in politics today the status quo, that they're at an impasse, that neither is going to defeat the other. He has to get away because the sun has come up. Rashi, of course, says he has to go and say Shira, but there's all kinds of different Mefarshim that give you different insights. And some of them say, as I'm indicated, that Eisav's Malach was defeated not by Yaakov Avinu, but by the daytime. And in fact, that's why they say, Sarisa im elikim v'imanoshim, not that Yaakov defeated a Malach, but that he was equal to him. Im elikim, he was equal to a Malach. He couldn't defeat Tzadei Shel Eisav. And just for the record, I have a class which I recently gave this year, and if it's not up yet, it'll be up very soon on my website, inside Chassidishe.org, in Parshas Vayishlach. It's on the later pasuk. Ki im beirachtani, 2 psukim later, where he says, I'm not going to let you go until you give me a bracha. And you can check it out, and I bring many different mefarshim, including many that indicate what I just said, that Yaakov and Eisav fought to a draw, and Eisav's Malach is defeated not by Yaakov Avinu, but by the daytime, by Oira Yoim. It seems to me, and this is, I guess, a bit of a conjecture, that once Yaakov defeated the Malach of Eisav, he had no fear of Eisav. The physical Eisav was an afterthought. In other words, the drama happened when Vayivasa Yaakov Levade. Nobody witnessed it. His entire family, his children, his wives, his servants were all carried across the Maamar Vayeavek. Yaakov was alone. He meets Malach Shel Eisav. They wrestle. The Malach Shel Eisav has to give a bracha. First, he has to concede to Yaakov Avinu that God Almighty is going to tell him that the brachas are not b'mirma, and then in fact, Vayeavek Eish Emo, he has to give him a bracha there as well. Again, the Mefarshim delve into all these particular details. When Yaakov then goes on to meet Eisav, it's still an event. It's still serious. It's still important. But the most important part of the battle, which is the spiritual war, has been won. And meeting Yaakov is Eisav Harasha Hagashmi is almost window dressing. I don't mean it entirely that way, but to a great degree, that's the spirit of the story, at least according to many readings of it. And that's what Yaakov Avinu was afraid of. And it all begins with the Pachim Ktanim. The beginning of the story is that Yaakov goes back to get some jugs, some leftover vessels. And of course, in Kabbalah, in Kisvei Hadizal, I believe even on these psukim, the Pachim Ketanim represent the smallest sparks, the lowest sparks. Teeny tiny little aspects that have the smallest measure of light and energy and godliness. Yaakov goes back to retrieve them. He encounters Tzadei Shel Eisav. They have a wrestle, and we all know the rest of the story. I want to propose something different. And the proposal I wish to make is based on the Maamar that we're going to learn today. Yaakov Avinu goes back for Pachim Ketanim. He goes back for small jugs. The small jugs that Yaakov Avinu goes back to retrieve are the Malach of Eisav himself. Or precise, perhaps a little bit more refined, he cannot get the godliness out of those lowest of jugs unless he has the collaboration, the partnership of Sadish Eisav. Sadish Eisav is a bad guy, and he's connected to the lowest things. Yaakov wants to elevate even those lowest things. Those lowest things are not the Samach Mem, the Malach of Eisav himself, but they're the kind of godly possibility which can only be accessed and retrieved with the assistance, with the support of Sadish Eisav. So perhaps we're going to read into these words. He went back to Yed Pacham Ktanim. He went back to fight with the Malach of Eisav because only with his partnership would he be able to access and elevate those sparks. You know, there's a Maimeh Chazal that says that tzaddikim mamoinem chavav alayim yosem megufim. The tzaddikim value their wealth more than they value their own bodies. You know, there's the old joke about a bandit, a robber who approaches a man with a revolver and says, "Money of your life," and he says, "I'm thinking it over. I want to decide." It's a foolish. It's a joke, but in reality, it's kind of foolish. But by tzaddikim, we find such a concept. Mamoinam chavav alayim yosem megufim. And we witness it with the Rebbe on a variety of different occasions where he was very particular about his possessions being in the hands of various people. I know from a relative of mine that when the Rebbe moved out of his apartment on President Day, New York, they informed the Rebbe, they were not Lubavitchers, that they informed the Rebbe that they took his apartment. And the Rebbe was so happy that his apartment was taken over by a Yid and not by a non-Yid. I remember how the Rebbe would very seriously, terribly seriously, warn Hasidim against selling the mashke that he gave them to a goy, to a non-Jew. The Rebbe would give out vodka and he would ask people to drink it up for Pesach, not to give it to a non-Jew. I remember the expression chas v'shalom to verkaufen the mashke to a goy. It was after Purim. And it wasn't simply what he said, but the tone was the idea that a goy should have a possession that belonged to the Rebbe, that the koyach of a tzaddik was to the Rebbe very, very serious. Why? Why would a tzaddik value his possessions so much? Now, of course, the answer is because everything a tzaddik touches that's involved in tzaddik has some of that kedusha, that holiness, and the kedusha never departs. And when it goes into the wrong hands, that kedusha is in the wrong place. But there's another aspect. When a tzaddik extends his holiness to material things, to things that have much less life, the holiness of the tzaddik and those lowly things is in a way greater than the holiness of the tzaddik and the tzaddik's own body, because it's being extended to something much, much lower. And therefore, there's something very unique about the idea that the neches, the material, the possessions of a tzaddik, even the daimim, the lifeless possessions, have within themselves the holiness of the tzaddik. And in a different way, perhaps, this is the notion of pacham ktanim. I remember reading how the Rebbe Rashab moved from Lubavitch to Rostov, and he commented to somebody, "Bei mir wird nicht bleiben kein ein Brettel, nicht kein Besucher dicke." I saw it in the name of Rabbi Yankov Landau, I remember now. "By me there will not remain a single board, unrefined, unelevated." The slats, the parquet on his floor, he was going to bring kedusha into it. And this, it's not only that he's elevating everything, but that he is, as the Rebbe often uses the expression from the Alter Rebbe in Teirei Likutei Torah, the mashal of the lever. When you want to lift something up, you have to lift it up from the very bottom. And accordingly, by tzaddikim, they want to elevate everything that comes into their sphere, everything comes to their space from the very bottom, from the very, very lowest levels. And this is another way, the pacham ktanim. It's the pacham ktanim for which the Alter Rebbe went back. It's not also slippers. It's not even slippers. It's especially slippers, and especially worn slippers. On the lowest level, there is a unique kind of presence of the kedusha of a tzaddik. In the piece of Maimir, we're going to learn tonight, with Hashem's help, we're going to encounter this idea that the very lowest levels, where there is so little godliness, there is godliness as well. And the Vayeavek Eish Emo, the wrestle between Yaakov and Eisav, extends that low. Here's what I want to do. And the problem is, I want to do it, and I can't do it perfectly because the Maimid is not sufficiently explicit. The Maimid is kind of vague. I want to build this class around 3 translations of the word Vayeavek. What's the translation of the word Vayeavek? Vayeavek Eish Emo. And our Maamar, of course, started on line 1, line 2. Vayeavek Eish Emo is the wrestle between Klipa and Kedusha. Eisav's Malach wants to take something from Yaakov Avinu, and he knows that he can only take it from the emotional levels of Yaakov Avinu, and so forth, as our Maamar explained. How do you translate the word Vayeavek? And it seems to me that there's 3 translations of the word Vayeavek. There's 3 translations of the word Vayeavek because there's 3 readings of this pasuk. The first reading of this pasuk was, I guess, last week. The second reading of this pasuk was also last week. And it's the third reading of this pasuk that we're going to do tonight. Eisav's malach wants to leech from Yaakov Avinu, but there's 2 methods. The first is called Makif Ha'elyon. He wants to bypass Yaakov Avinu. He wants to go higher than Adam. He wants to go to Ein Sof and draw a light from the Ein Sof where there is no cheshbon. And Yaakov cuts him off. Yaakov cuts him off because although Yaakov is lower than the Ein Sof, if Yaakov can focus the Ein Sof, it'll go only to Kedusha, not to Klipa. To Mokam Haroy and the Mokam She'enei Roy. The second thing is Eisav is thinking to draw from Yaakov himself. But when he's drawing from Yaakov himself, he has to draw from those levels of Yaakov Avinu which are drawable, which means he can only draw from the heart and down, because Eisav's malach thinks that on the emotional level, Yaakov is demonstrative, passionate, showing the emotion on the outside, which is the beginning of where Klipa can draw from Kedusha. And he fails on both score. Yaakov does not allow him to draw from Makif Ha'elyon. Yaakov does not allow him to pass him by and go to the Ein Sof. And Yaakov also does not allow Eisav's malach to draw from the more demonstrative, external, emotional aspects of Yaakov Avinu. In both cases, he cuts him off. And there, accordingly, the word Vayeavek, what does Vayeavek mean? It's a different translation. Now, the first Vayeavek is very difficult to pin down, because it's on line 37, if you want to go back. 37, Vayeavek Eish Emo, she'ratza samachmem lagbiya kanesha v'cholu. What do these words mean? The malach of Eisav is wrestling with Yaakov Avinu because he wishes to raise himself higher than Yaakov Avinu. So you would translate Vayeavek Eish Emo, the word Vayeavek means there is a man who is trying to get past Yaakov Avinu. And if I was entitled to an interpretation, and I'm really not, I would say, Vayeavek Eish, there is a malach that meets Yaakov Avinu, Emo, who wants to make Yaakov tafel. He wants to make Yaakov secondary. Vayeavek, he's engaging with Yaakov, but he's engaging with Yaakov in such a way where he doesn't want to meet Yaakov. He wants to make Yaakov unimportant. He wants to get past Yaakov and go to the Ein Sof. So if, again, Vayeavek Eish, the malach of Eisav is trying to make from Yaakov Avinu, Emo, something secondary. So I guess we would translate in this first translation, he's engaging with Yaakov Avinu, but his intent is not to defeat Yaakov, but to avoid him, to get past him, to go on to something beyond. So Vayeavek Eish, this malach, is engaging with Yaakov Avinu, Emo, in the hope to render Yaakov Avinu as tafel. And secondary is unimportant. It's the first translation of Vayeavek. The second translation is explicit in the Maamar, and it's on line 52. Vayeavek miloshen chibuk. He embraces Yaakov Avinu. He embraces Yaakov Avinu, interprets the Maamar, you embrace with your hands. The hands represent the emotions. They're parallel to the heart. And Yaakov is the malach of Eisav is embracing Yaakov Avinu with his hands because he understands that on the level of Yaakov Avinu's mind, there's no way he's going to be able to draw life. On the level of Yaakov Avinu's emotions, he thinks this is the beginning of the demonstrative, showy, passionate, external Yaakov where Klipa can begin to nourish, and that's why he embraces, his heart embraces the heart of Yaakov Avinu in the hope of being able to draw from the external, from the murgash levels of Yaakov Avinu to Klipa. So the first read Vayeavek Eish Emo is, Ish is fighting with Yaakov to get past him. The second translation of Vayeavek Eish Emo means he's hugging Yaakov on the emotional level in order to draw from the emotion of Yaakov into Klipa. But the third read of Vayeavek Eish Emo, as our Maamar is going to teach it us, is that when the Samach Mem, when the Malach of Eisav embraces Yaakov, Yaakov embraces him back. Vayeavek Eish Emo, as the man wrestles, Emo wrestles back. Vayeavek Eish Emo means that Yaakov is wrestling back, and he wants to hug Sarei Shel Eisav. And this becomes the third idea in this Maamar. Malach of Eisav meets Yaakov, and they fight. And the impression that we get is all Yaakov wants to do is get away. Leave me alone. And the Malach doesn't leave him alone, and Yaakov fights him to a stalemate. The sun comes up, and the Malach of Eisav has no choice but to first inform him that one day God is going to call him Yisrael, to indicate that the brachas are his legitimately. And then, because of whatever additional details, Vayeavek Eish Emo, he has to actually agree and bless him on the spot. He's not allowed to wait till Parshas Vayishlach. Later on Parshas Vayishlach. But here's another read. Vayeavek Eish Emo, the Malach of Eisav meets Yaakov, and Yaakov says, happy to meet you. You want something from me? Well, I want something from you. It's a whole new read. In other words, this is not anymore about the Sareh Shal Eisav trying to draw from Yaakov Avinu. Klipa trying to draw from Kedusha, either from Makav Ha'elyev, from Ribit Tzimtzumim. There's something else going on here. Yaakov meets Eisav and says, I'm happy to meet you. You want to take from me? Well, I have something that I want to take from you, and I need you to take it. Because these sparks are so low, are so without life, that without the help of Malach Shal Eisav, Yaakov simply cannot access the spark, the goodness within them. So the Malach of Eisav is Vayeavek Eish Emo, means translation of what he wants to get past Yaakov. Translation number 2, he's hugging Yaakov on the emotional level. And translation number 3 is that he's being hugged in return. And Yaakov doesn't only survive Malach Shal Eisav and get the Malach of Eisav to agree with him, he actually suctions away, takes from the Malach of Eisav such lowly sparks that he would never be able to access without the partnership of Malach of Eisav itself. So Vayeavek Eish Emo Adal Eisav now means that Yaakov is hugging the Malach of Eisav back and taking these lowest of sparks and elevating them and bringing them back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So those are the 3 translations of Vayeavek. Now let's learn the Maamar. We're beginning on line 65. In addition to the first 2 concepts that we had, the first concept is Eisav's Malach trying to get from Machiavellian. And the second concept is Eisav's Malach trying to get from the bottom of the chain, which is called before the Char de Klipa against Zoh, against the Ze'er Amp and the masculine aspect of Kedusha. We also have Bebechinas Malchus de Klipa. There is something called the Malchus of Klipa, the lowest levels of Klipa, which of course are Zel Yumazev, the Malchus of Kedusha, the very lowest levels of Klipa, which have very, very little life. And Vayeavek denotes that there is a wrestle taking place even on these levels, but now the tables are turned. The Malach of Eisav doesn't think that there'd be any point in trying to draw from Malchus of Kedusha. It's so little. But Malchus of Kedusha says, I want to get even those tiny sparks of Klipa, Malchus of Lumaz, and bring it back to the Eibishter. And Vayeavek is not about the Malach wrestling with Yaakov, it's about Yaakov wrestling with the Malach and saying to the Malach, you're going to partner, you're going to help me elevate these sparks. And the Rebbe explains it. To understand this third idea of Vayeavek, where Yaakov is meeting the Malach of Eisav, and the Malach of Eisav has his interests, and Yaakov is not only trying to survive him, but he has a counter interest to take something from Eisav's Malach, is indicated in the word Vayeavek, from the word dust. And in order to explain this, we must draw a distinction, Chebein Ofar LaAvok Sheniskar Bezeir. The difference between Ofar and Avok. Ofar means earth, and Avok means dust. And I suppose if you needed to translate it as Ofar, it would mean fertile earth, organic earth, earth that's got all kinds of living substance and organisms and so forth, which are the basis for the growth of new life. And Avok means dust, like a desert. It has absolutely no, on the surface at least, any organic matter that allow it to be fertile and for things to grow. And he explains, Kihine, Dawud, you say this. We all know there are 4 elements: Eish, Ruach, Mayim, Avar, fire, wind, water, earth. Ha'afar hi tachteina shebakulam. Earth is the lowest of the 4. Ve'eish, Ruach, Mayim, while fire, wind, and water, Hei Magvayim Yesa, are above it. And incidentally, there's differences amongst Mekubalim, which is higher Eish or Ruach. Look it up. V'afar pikein, however, Kulam, in spite of the fact that earth is the lowest of the 4 elements, ein matzmich and pedis, fire, wind, and water cannot procreate, produce living fruit in the image of their parents. This is a pasuk, I think, in Eiv. Everything comes from the earth. In the lowest of the elements, you have the highest prospect. You've learned this in Chassidus, I'm sure. We've had opportunity to talk about it in these classes. It's also in Tanya. And he gets the Kedesh Siman Chof, and he gets the Kedesh Siman Ches, I believe, and in many other places. The Koyach Ein Sof is in the earth. The power of procreation is an infinite power, because it reverses the principle of entropy. Everything is going towards death. Reproduction is renewal. Things start from the beginning again. A child is born to parents. Whether those parents are 20, 30, 40, or 50, the child is born as the parents were when the parents were born. And the life cycle renews. It begins from the beginning, the whole process of order. And this koyach, to procreate and to demonstrate in the world the power of renewal, is infinite. And it's found in the feminine aspect, in the lowest level. There's all kinds of reasons why, but biologically, physically, it's in the earth. Va'atam, the reason is, Malchus, earth goes in the lowest level of Malchus. Umin ha'ofar, and from the earth, Asher yihye b'karka ha'mishkan, which sits on the bottom of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Mishkan, this is where life comes from. Now, I don't know for sure, but I suspect these words, Umin ha'ofar, Asher yihye b'karka ha'mishkan, is talking about the Saita, a woman who's been accused of being an adulteress. And earth from the Mishkan is incorporated and put into the water. But, of course, we all know the point of Saita is v'niksa v'nizra zara, that she should procreate, she should have children, or she should have children without any difficulties, or she should have beautiful children, and so forth. So, the earth that is taken from the floor of the Beis HaMikdash and added to the waters of the Saita, which mean many different things, I'm sure, also represents fertility. In other words, the way that Rebbe is reading this is that you're giving a Saita to drink water, based on a suspicion. You don't know for sure if she was an adulteress. She was alone with a man who you had warned her not to be with, and now she has to drink this water with the erased ink from the Parsha of Saita, and you put on earth. So according to this Maamar, the ink represents death, if she's in fact sinned. The earth in the Karka Mishkan is the fertility, the bracha, that if she is in fact pure, the nix of Nizra Zar, of children, the earth from the Mishkan gives that koyach. But it's only earth, not dust, not lower than earth. Earth is organic. It has all kinds of life within it, and that's why it has the possibility to procreate. Ube kedusha, and in the realms of ishtalshalos, it's bechinas eskalalus. It has to do with the idea of interconnectedness. The lowest level, the earth, is connected with the Ein Sof, and moreover, it's not just connected to all levels, but specifically v'nos chilosan b'seif and dafka is a unique connection between the lowest level and the highest level. And since the earth is the lowest element, and you have this idea of Ofar Ashiyah B'Karka Mishkan, it allows the Ein Sof to manifest in procreation. We all know on the Apostle there's a connection between the beginning and the end. And the connection between the beginning and the end is in the word Ani. Ani goes on the Eibishter, I. But Shamalchus, who are Kesed, is called Ani. The Eibishter, Malchus, which is Kesed, is called Ani. But when Kesed comes down to the lowest level, it's no longer called Ani, it's called Ayin. Yossi is Ayin. So, as the godliness exists in the highest level, it's called Ani Rishon. As the godliness comes down to the lowest level, it's called Ani Achron. It's also called Ayin. And in this highest level, which then comes down to the lowest level, you have the Koyach of Ein Sof. The notion that Chochmah comes from Ayin, he says Ayin over here means Keser. The Ayin is not Chochmah itself, the Ayin is Keser. Hu Keser, which is Keser, the very highest levels of Ishtalshalos. Shehu Mutza ben Amayz l'Natzolim, it stands in between the essence of the Ein Sof and the revelation of the Ein Sof, Lies Mi'ayin Liyesh, and it creates the possibility of revealing the infinite power of God in the lowest levels, that there be procreation, there be the renewal of life. So in the earth, you have the Ein Sof, based on the principle that the lowest level has the highest source. The level of Malchus has this possibility, because the level of Malchus is the lowest of the four elements. Hu bechinas Ofar is the idea of earth, or organic earth, and although it's the lowest level, it has within itself the power of the Ein Sof to create life from the beginning again, brand new. Latzmiach kol tzamach adama, to sprout all the things that grow from the earth. Begashmi is physically, begam beruchni is spiritually as well. Yeshkeach la malchus, the lowest of the 10 spheres, has this possibility. Shu seif amadregis, it's the lowest level of each world. Meked is arusa de latata. Lies is arusa de liela, it's the idea of an arousal that comes from below, that will bring an arousal that comes from above. Lahamshach eina yutzfir zechol, to bring down the 10 spheres and to bring down the Ein Sof and so forth. In short, Afar, earth, represents the lowest level, and in the lowest of levels you have the Ein Sof, which is the highest of levels because of all kinds of mystical principles. But it's Afar, because it's organic. Masha ein kein avak. Dust is completely without life. The sand in a desert is not organic, it's inorganic. And he compares it to ash. Hu de ishtar min nure, it's what's left over from a fire. Kimashal ha'etzim, for example, wood, shedelkem be'eish, when you burn it. Sha'eish, that the fire is shoyev yaseid eish ruach mayim. It will draw out whatever energy, whatever gas, whatever moisture there is in this piece of wood, which is inside of it. It will initiate ella, and all that remains is yaseid ha'afar, the element of earth. In other words, hu ha'efer, which is the ash. It's all that's left. And you know, in Torah, when they speak about the mazik of Eish, right? Eish, there's various different ideas of Maamar Mazik, where the wealth, the property of somebody does damage. There's how an animal does in heaven, and one of them is fire. If you light a fire in your possession, it travels from your house to your neighbor's house, and it burns the ground. A man plowed his field, and nothing has grown yet, but the earth has been turned over, and when the fire goes across it, it dries it out, it becomes infertile, it becomes what they call a dust bowl. It goes from being afar to being afer, from earth to ash, or in this case, dust, as is the case with the desert. And the Rebbe says, Ve'efer zeh hu einei matzmiach. And when the earth has become dust or ash, it no longer gives life, no longer procreates. But the Rebbe is very careful how he words this. He doesn't say that from dust you won't get any life. He says it's more difficult to get life. How? And again, this is not a class in biology, and I'm not qualified to teach biology, so I don't know all the biological details to all of this, but the mystical is that in the earth you have the power of the Eisav, but when earth has turned to dust, the power of the Eisav is much more dormant, and therefore, that when you have fertile earth, I'm reading the parenthesis, Shem matzmiach me'atzmei, things will grow by themselves. It says in Tanya, and it's brought to Chassidus, that according to Torah, the earth will sprout and produce new life without a seed, just by itself. You know, if you study volcanoes and how life forms on volcanoes. Volcanoes are fresh earth that's coming up from beneath the sea, and of course the earth is very organic because the earth, which is made from the lava, has all kinds of organic material, but they talk about the seeds being carried by the wind or coconuts and other methods. According to Torah, it's conceivable that there should be spontaneous growth, that the earth by itself should sprout and produce life, but only if it's afar. If it's aphid, if it's dust, then it will not produce life unless you plant a seed. And that's the argument here in this Maamar. The Rebbe does not want to say that there is no life at all in dust. If you plant and you irrigate, you can get from the desert life also. But it's not nearly as easy or as simple as getting life from fertile earth, from earth which is not dust. Because when it comes to fertile earth, you leave it alone, it'll just grow by itself. While when it comes to earth that's been turned to dust, unless you invest incredible effort, nothing will grow. So avok, dust or ash, has some life. Not nearly as much life as afar, as earth, because it's much more difficult to yield a crop, but it's still theoretically possible to make this level of lifelessness be the basis for life. In other words, reveal the power of the Eisav in creating a new life. While afar, earth, that's organic, it's much, much easier. It'll even grow by itself, as the Maamar describes it. Now listen to this. Why is it so important to the Rebbe to walk this fine line and say that even dust can be made to grow life and to become fertile? It's because it's kosher to cover blood. There's a mitzvah that when you shecht a bird or a wild animal, a non-domestic animal, a chai, you have to cover the blood with earth. And there's different criteria what constitutes earth. And ash is qualified. Now, if earth means something which is fertile, however you explain the mysticism of this mitzvah of kisei dam b'yafar, the fact that you can cover the blood with ash or with dust, and it's considered covering the blood, proves that whatever aspect or attribute afar needs, aphid and avak also possess, which is an organic quality. So our Maamar doesn't want to say that dust and ash have no life at all, have no Eisav at all. They're simply saying it's much, much more difficult to extract. Kach al derech mashal, accordingly. Okay, let's pause. Stop right here. So, we understand that afar is the lowest of the four elements, but afar at least is organic. And lower than afar is aphid and avak, ash and dust, which is not entirely inorganic, but it takes so much more effort to extract, as you'll see later on in the next parenthesis, a much, much smaller yield. So the Rebbe continues and he says, you should know there is a klipa against malchus as well. If kedusha is offer, malchus of kedusha is offer, malchus of liyuma says efer or avak. In other words, in malchus of kedusha is also very little life. In malchus of liyuma there's even less. Says the Rebbe, he achar gmar kol habirurim. And this dust and this ash is what remains after all of the clarifications, all of the elevations of sparks have been done. And what happens? How does it work? And he describes it as follows. She'ikar avayis haklip is the basis for the formation of negativity, of lifelessness. Is the initial event of the shattering of the vessels of Elam Atayu. And of course these vessels, when they fell, had great energy in them, had great godliness, light, life, and energy within them that needs to be redeemed. What is redeemed first? The choicest, who nasa atzilus, becomes the godly realm of atzilus. Va'anisha nasa bria, and what's remaining becomes bria, and then the rest is disposed of again, v'chulu. So the way the bira, this is called in Chassidus, bira rishon l'mayla lamata, how God does a bira from the top down. The sparks of tayu were dispersed, a light of God shines, v'chochma is beriru, draws in the best of those sparks of tayu, creates atzilus, disposes of the rest. Then a lesser light shines again, v'chochma is beriru, draws in the lesser level of exact sparks and makes from it bria, and the rest are disposed of a second time. Then a lesser light still, also b'chochma b'riru, shines and draws the best of what's left of those sparks to create Elam HaYetzira, and the rest is disposed of. And then a lesser light still, but also b'chochma b'riru, shines in order to create Asiyah Ruchnis, the spiritual Asiyah. And what's left after that, that's the junk, that's in the basement, which is called in Kabbalah B'tachtes HaAsiyah. The lowest klipis, which are left over after anything useful has been redeemed and elevated and perfected and corrected and been organized, is what falls tachtas ha'asiyah. That's dust. And Eisav is busy trying to wrestle with Yankov to take from the higher levels of Kedusha, whether it's from Makav Elyon or from Midas. Well, guess what? Yankov's got a trick up his sleeve. He's wrestling with Eisav because he wants to elevate even that. The very lowest step. Save kol habirurim, the very end of all order. And listen to these words. There's nothing left to redeem. It's just dust. It's junk. It's not life. Sham heima klipis. That's where there is klipa. But v'lei nishar b'hem elachayis mut. Now how do you read those words? One reading, of course, is they have very little life. But the other reading is there's still a little life. And that's the final interpretation of the pasuk Vayeavek Eish Emo. Avek, like dust. When you work with this desert, at least it will produce life. It can't be compared to fertile earth. That first of all, it will spontaneously grow. And when you grow plant on fertile earth, in other words, you don't simply allow it to grow by itself, but you invest in fertile earth. Of course, the better the earth, the better the yield. But the more you work with the earth, the better the yield will be still. While with dust, if you don't work, nothing is going to happen. And if you do work, the yield will be very measured. So the dust and the ash is what's left over after anything redeemable has been redeemed. And the argument of this Maimon is that dust also has some life. This very lowest levels of life is representative of the times of Golos, because Aval Osad Lavu, when Mashiach comes, this will no longer exist. Whatever last sparks are in this dust will be redeemed and they're going to disappear. I'll tell you what this means. We talk about elevating sparks. Earlier generations elevated greater sparks. Lower generations elevated lesser sparks, yeah? We are the lowest generations, we elevate the lowest sparks. When does it finish? The real answer to that question is it never does. It always can be lower. There'll always be, when you separate a spark from a klipa, you take the spark, elevate, the klipa is disposed of. Now that junk to the next generation is a spark. They elevate the spark, they dispose of it. When does it finish? It never finishes. And that's why you say, Shechishav as a Kates Lasses, God decided there's going to be an end to Golos, because there's always a justification for another generation. There is still godliness in those, in the dust of dust, so to speak. And that's why we say, To completely remove klipa, Hashem has to extract every drop of godliness from the lowest levels of klipas, and once they don't have any godliness, they will vanish. But in the meantime, they do have godliness. And Yaakov is wrestling back. Razal 83, line 83, that Yaakov is wrestling with Eisav. Eisav's malach thinks he's trying to take from Yaakov Avinu, and Yaakov Avinu is trying to preserve himself. What he doesn't realize is Yaakov's got his own agenda. And he's wrestling the malach of Eisav because he wants to elevate the sparks that are so low that they're called dust. And Yaakov by himself cannot steep that low without the help, the collaboration of Allah Shal Eisav. Helu avok at kis Yaakov, the Chazal tell us. They raised up the dust till the heavenly throne. In other words, he bechinas malchus datzilas. In other words, shagam bechinas avok, this level of earth, which is infertile, which is representative of a desert, and ash is niskala lamayla, can also be elevated. Ayde abira sheyakov, through the initiative of Yaakov Avinu, to find something where you see what appears to be no life at all and extract life from there as well. Kamei, just as Vayeavek Eish Emo, as Eisav's malach is trying to wrestle and extract from Yaakov Avinu, Gam Yaakov nischazek ubired mimenu. Yaakov's got his own business. He's not simply trying to survive Sarav Shal Eisav, he wants to take from him. What can he take from Eisav? Eisav wants more life. Eisav wants life from Ofer or from Mayim or from Ruach, in other words, from Malchus or from Zoh. He wants to get higher, more robust, more obvious vitality from Kedusha. And Kedusha is not just trying to survive him, he wants to take from Eisav the tiny bit of life that he has, that by itself is absolutely lifeless, and raise it up to the Eibishter as well. And listen to this, the parenthesis, the Torah describes, the Chazal tell us, that as they wrestled, they collectively, Yaakov and the Malach of Eisav combined, raised up this dust till the Kith Yaakovid, Lefi Shahabirir Hoya Ayadei Shneim. The elevation of these lowest sparks can only happen by the collaboration, the partnership of Yaakov and Malach of Eisav. So Yaakov has his own point of view. I have no choice. I got to deal with this guy because he will give me access to sparks that are so low by myself I could never get to them. Yaakov hu ha-mevarer, v'samach mem hu ha-mizbarer. Yaakov is the one creating the clarity. The samach mem is the one who is being given clarity. So Vayeavek Eish Emo. Well, let's go back to what I said to you before. Vayevosa Yaakov levad. Yaakov remains alone because he went back for pacham ktanim. Perhaps, according to this Maamar, the Pacham Ketana that he went back for was to meet the Malach of Eisav. The Malach of Eisav has his own agenda. He wants to draw from Malach of Elyon, which is one taich of Vayeavek Eish Emo. He wants to draw from Nibitz and Tumim, which is a second translation of Vayeavek Eish Emo. And Yaakov wants to deal with dust itself, which is the third translation of Vayeavek Eish Emo. And you learn in Chassidus that in the lowest levels of Birurin, there's something called Shem Bana Mizbarer. On the very lowest levels, the clarifier and the clarified fuse and they become inseparable. Yaakov, together with the Malach of Eisav, only that combination can find sparks in lifeless dust and ash and bring it up to the Kis Yaakov. And he explained, as the Samach Mem, as the Malach of Eisav embraces Yodav with his arms, Chesed Gevura, Al Guvasha Yankov on the body of Yaakov Avinu, either because he wants to bypass him and make Ish into Ime and go to Makav Elyon, or because he thinks that from the midas of Yaakov Avinu he can draw to Klipa. Says this Maamar, Kach Yachovak Yodav Yankov Chesed Gevura Shalei. Yaakov Avinu was simultaneously embracing the Samach Mem, Al Gufesh Al Samach Mem. This is the method of wrestle. When one wrestles with the first is wrestling with the second. And Yankov's agenda is not only to survive Malach Shal Eisav, but to use this encounter to elevate the sparks in the dust, which is so low that Yankov by himself would never be able to elevate them. And this is what happens when we fight the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is trying to bring us down. And we're not just trying to survive him, we're trying to bring him down. A person must always anger the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. Now, what's the simple reading of this Gemara? You should always anger the Yetzer Tov against the Yetzer Hara. It's a Gemara. You'll be angry at Yetzer Hara, you won't listen to him. Here the Maamar is saying something different. You'll be angry at the Yetzer Hara and you'll defeat him. You'll take from the Yetzer Hara. Not only will you not give the Yetzer Hara, but you will actually take from him. And he calls this tshuva. This notion of retrieving sparks of life from where there is no life on the appearance, on the surface, is the koyach tshuva. What is tshuva? Tshuva is special. Why is tshuva special? Tshuva is special because when a person is doing tshuva, the motivation for the tshuva is the sin. It says in Tanya chapter 7, it's also brought in Igeres HaTshuva, Perek Ches, the Machchan Lebechel Yatir. About tshuva is higher than a tzaddik because he works harder, he brings out more energy. But the additional motivation of the Baal Tshuva comes from the sin itself. That's what's special about tshuva. Here's an example. Yaakov is engaging with the wrestle with Eisav because he needs Eisav, he needs evil to be able to elevate these lowly sparks, which is what tshuva is. You're using klipa to defeat the klipa itself. Ki habida, this level of clarification and elevation, of dust and lifelessness, hainu inyan tshuva v'chol. This is not the ordinary bidur. If you're familiar with the mysticism, there's 4 levels. There's mitzvahs, there's birurim, there's tshuva, and there's nisyonis. Mitzvahs are mamshach mamalik kalalman, birurim mamshach sevav kalalman, tshuva is mamshach even a higher level, and nisyonis reveals something which is even higher than all those other levels. In other words, when you do a mitzvah, you're bringing godliness into a godly space. When you're doing, I said it wrong. There's mitzvahs, birurim, tshuva, and nisyonis. When you're doing a mitzvah, you're bringing godliness into it. When you're doing a bidur, you're elevating a spark of klipa. When you're doing but a spark that could be elevated, which is a spark of klipas neiga. When you're doing tshuva, you're elevating a spark of sholosh klipas atmeis. And when you have a test, you're elevating something that has no spark of godliness, like it says in the Maamar. But ordinary bidur is klipas neiga. This bidur is tshuva. It's mevarer sholosh klipas atmeis. And on this we say, "B'makom shaval tshuva v'chulu." The Gemara says, and the Rama brings it lahalacha that bal tshuva higher than tzaddikim, and the Zayir explains it because the mashchale bechele yata, they draw with extra energy, and the extra energy that a bal tshuva has that a tzaddik does not is from the klipa that he's overcoming. V'hainu melchemet zeh liyum hazeh. This is a wrestle. That just like you have a wrestle on the level of Ze'er Ampin, but on the level of Ze'er Ampin, klipa is trying to get more chayes from kedusha, and kedusha is trying to survive that. Says the Rebbe al derach is barar gam ha'ovek b'melchemet zeh liyum hazeh denukva. There is also a process, a wrestle on the level of malchus, but in the level of malchus, klipa is not trying to draw from kedusha. Kedusha has so little to give. Rather, kedusha is trying to draw from klipa. It says in the Zayir, Al postik b'chol avavcha b'veis yitzarecha dahu raza v'chulu. I don't know what the Zayir is. In the Maamar Vayeavek on the Torah Or, it's vague about what the Zayir is, but clearly what the Zayir is saying is it's one thing to serve Hashem with the Yetzer Tov. It's another thing to curtail, to quiet the Yetzer Hara. It's a third thing to incorporate the Yetzer Hara into Avodas Hashem. You're elevating such sparks that without the Yetzer Hara would be inaccessible. V'ha'avaku, and this dust is Malchus de Klipa. And of course the Maamar says, Olad kis yakovet. Even these lowliest of sparks, which are only elevated through the Koyach HaTshuva, because they're being mavada the very lowest sparks, and only with the help of Eisav's Malach can Yaakov access them that raises up till Kedusha. Malchus, so we know that the levels of Malchus. It's the lowest level of each world. And from the lowest level of the higher world, it descends to the lowest level of the world below. Ad Malchus Dasi, which is Maked Ha'avak, the source of dust. In each world, the Malchus is the beginning of the division. In other words, in each world, Malchus is still Kedusha. And from Malchus, the Nor expands into Dal Naharis and so forth, and the beginning of Klipa is the Malchus of Asiyah. Kizav and Nukva, the Klipa, is Nevizav and Nukva, the Kedusha. And on the Zal level, there's more godliness. On the Malchus level, there is much, much less godliness. And the beginning of the division of Klipa is from Malchus of Kedusha. And the clarity and the elevating of these sparks is Liyes Malchus the Klipa, that even Malchus of Klipa, which is so lowly, it's considered death, it's considered totally no good. And when Mashiach comes, it's going to vanish. Nechlal Malchus the Kedusha is elevated to Malchus of Kedusha, and that's Yaakov's reciprocal intent. So the Eisav is wrestling with Yaakov Avinu because he wants something from Yaakov. And Yaakov is not only trying to survive him, he's wrestling back, he wants to take something back from him. I don't know why the Rebbe here continues to refer back to Zoh. The key point of tonight's lesson is that you want to draw from such a low level of Klipa, that Klipa doesn't even think to draw from Kedusha, but Kedusha doesn't want to give up on any sparks altogether.